that's behind the idea of the OAH and peace collaboration.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Kievit, and I'm the interim director of the Dyckman Farmhouse Museum. Thank you for attending our fourth panel discussion of our Dyckman Discussion Panel Series. I would like to thank our panelists, Jennifer Anderson, Sylvia Hollis, Lauren Brincat, and Myra Armstead, for participating in this panel titled Slavery in Greater New York. I would also like to thank Holy Trinity Church for hosting us today. And finally, I would like to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities and TD Bank for sponsoring the Dyckman Discussions lecture series. Dyckman Discussions is a 2-year discussion series focusing on exploring topics in New York history, such as forced removal of indigenous people, Dutch colonization, enslaved labor, and immigration. Slavery in Greater New York is the fourth panel in a series of 5 taking place this year in 2023. In 2024, the museum will host a series of community dialogues that build on the panel discussions from this year. These dialogues will discuss issues that are important in today's social and political climate, and we hope this project will allow members of the community to connect with each other, resulting in an even more unified community than the one that already exists in Inwood. I will now introduce our panel chair, Jennifer Anderson. Jennifer Anderson is an associate professor of history at Stony Brook University. She specializes in early American and Caribbean history. She has a doctorate from NYU and a master's from the Winterthur program in early American culture. She is the author of Mahogany, The Cost of Luxury in Early America, which explores how consumer demand for tropical hardwoods harvested by enslaved Africans transformed 18th century social and environmental relations in the Atlantic region. Her fellowships and awards include ACLS Fellowship, the Early American Studies Murin Prize, the Society of American Historians Nevins Prize, a Mellon Postdoctoral Fellowship, and an Emmy nomination for research for Traces of the Trade, a documentary about the Northern slave trade. She has worked as a curator, researcher, exhibition developer, and consultant at over a dozen museums. There will be a chance for audience members to ask questions and engage with our speakers after they have presented. I will now hand things over to Jennifer Anderson.
Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on an absolutely beautiful day in Inwood. I haven't actually been in your neighborhood in quite a while, and so it's really wonderful to come back and see in the post-COVID era, your neighborhood looking so vibrant and lively. So thanks for taking time out, and I hope we'll have an interesting conversation. So thank you for the introduction, and it's my pleasure to chair today's panel, which brings together several influential leaders in public history who really are playing an important role in fostering more public knowledge and awareness of the lives of enslaved Africans and African Americans in the North. So before I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves, I'd like to thank the Dyckman House for bringing us all together. Then before our panelists will each speak, I'm going to provide a little bit of context about the pervasiveness of slavery in Greater New York, and then our panelists will each share a little bit about their particular emphases. Now, it's funny, I actually became interested in the history of Northern slavery when I was a college student at Barnard, and I took several courses with Professor Eric Foner when he was at Columbia University, and got really interested in the history of abolition and Reconstruction that were his specialties. And it was only later I went into the museum field with no intention of pursuing the topic of slavery in the North until, by serendipity, I became the director of a historic site just north of here in the Hudson Valley, Phillipsburg Manor, which some of you may know is part of the historic Hudson Valley organization. And while I was there, they initiated a major project to explore the history of the enslaved people who had lived and worked there. It was, much to my surprise, having not really learned about this before, a slave plantation in New York with its roots in the late 17th and early 18th century. And so that sort of set me on this path at a time when really not that many people were aware that slavery even existed in the North, much less the role that Northern merchants had in the transatlantic slave trade, which I had a chance to explore in the working on that documentary, Traces of the Trade, the history of slavery in the deep North. And what my introducer didn't mention was that indeed I worked at over a dozen historic sites and museums across our region, all of which had ties to slavery. And my work really has focused on helping them to pursue new research, develop more accurate exhibitions, and more inclusive and more engaging educational and interpreter planning programs. Yet, as I think our speakers today will help us appreciate, we're still learning, and there's still a long way to go in raising public awareness about this important chapter of our shared history. For example, it was only in 2019 that the Long Island Museum opened the region's first groundbreaking exhibition on the topic, entitled Long Road to Freedom, Surviving Slavery on Long Island. I worked as an advisor on the exhibit. It was a wonderful installation, fascinating new research, great attendance, a remarkably diverse audience coming to the programming, coming to see the exhibit. Unfortunately, it closed after 3 months. And there really wasn't anything to fill the void that had happened. So fortunately, Lauren's going to tell you another initiative that we're working on Long Island, and there are other institutions that are beginning to do this. So hopefully there will be a stronger public history focus of this than there has been in the past. So with that, I'm going to ask my panelists to introduce themselves, and then I'll make a few contextual remarks and do your thing.
Great.
Please, Lauren.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lauren Brinkat, and I am the curator at Preservation Long Island. We are a regional organization with the mission to celebrate and preserve Long Island's diverse cultural and architectural heritage through advocacy, education, and the stewardship of historic sites and collections that are spread across really Suffolk County on Long Island. So as the curator, I am charged with the management, care, and interpretation of our historic properties and our object and archival collections. Keep going into my...
Well, hello. Let's have Myra, and then I'm going to just set the scene a little bit. Please.
I'm Myra Young Armstead, and I'm a professor of history at Bard College. When I got to Bard in 1985, which was a long time ago, the National Historic Site, which is now known as Montgomery Place, was still owned by the family. And a year later, it was sold to Historic Hudson Valley. And someone there approached Bard, and that approach filtered down to me because the family papers from 1828 forward, actually from 1804 forward, were there, and there was a lot on enslavement, and they were looking for someone to interpret that. That intrigued me. I had other projects. It intrigued me because I was just coming out of graduate school, and I think slave historiography was burgeoning at that time, but all focused on the South. And we were taught as graduate students that there were two exceptions in the North, the Hudson Valley and Narragansett Bay. And we knew that, and we just sort of accepted that and didn't question. So I will be talking about a project that has allowed me to take a deep dive into slavery and slaveholding in the North at a National Historic Site in Saratoga Springs.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sylvia Hollis. I teach at Montgomery College, which is in Maryland. I'm a professor of African American and African history in Maryland. Most of what I'll talk to you all today about will be the framing of my master's thesis that was done in the fall. It'll be almost 20 years when I first started doing that research. And I grew up in the South. I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. And for my graduate program, I attended Cooperstown graduate program in upstate New York. And likewise, much of the way that I had learned to think about slavery and the condition of Black servitude and conditions of slavery had been through the lens of this kind of the South, slavery, the North, abolition intellectual framework. And when I got to Cooperstown, I learned of this Black group of people that lived in that village whose tombstones reflected that they lived there and died there, some before 1827, which is before the gradual emancipation laws. And I set out to make that my master's thesis. So I'll speak to you all about the process of making that master's thesis a reality from the years of 2004 to 2006, and also kind of do a brief commentary on what it's meant to learn and think about the history of slavery since, and engaging with my students in the classroom about that as a topic that does not consider just a kind of a South slavery, North freedom lens.
Okay, great. Yeah, so what we're really going to be focusing on is the period that is subsequent to the early Dutch period, which was explored on one of the earlier panels, the period during which slavery was introduced to New Netherland in the 17th century, and then continues to expand after the English takeover in 1664. And throughout the 18th century, the enslaved population in colonial New York continued to grow, averaging between 11 and 18%, depending on exactly when and where you're looking. And as is often cited by historians, by the mid-18th century, New York had more enslaved Africans than any colony north of Maryland. And it's a very fascinating period, the early 18th century, because you see a lot of intersection between Native peoples working alongside enslaved people from Africa and often from the Caribbean, as well as indentured servants from different parts of Europe. So from the beginning, New York was a polyglot place, a very diverse place. But our focus today really is on those enslaved people who were in the surrounding hinterlands, areas around New York City. And we know, based on ongoing research, that there were enslaved people pretty much in every part of New York during the colonial period. By the 1770s, for example, in Westchester, the Black population was about 15%, the vast majority of whom were held in bondage. On Long Island, the enslaved population was as high as 34% in Kings County, 17% in Queens County, and I think Lauren's going to talk a little bit more about Long Island. In some ways, the hinterlands of New York City, parts of them were a little bit unusual, as you mentioned, with the Hudson Valley and Long Island as well. They developed as major agricultural areas dominated by large landowners and specialized in growing wheat and other grains for exports, especially to the sugar islands of the Caribbean. And given the large labor force that was required for that form of production, those regions developed plantation systems that relied on larger numbers of enslaved workers. And in fact, my current research focuses on a number of sites where the owners had owned property both in New York and in the Caribbean and moved people back and forth between those locations. But for the most part, as we're learning in the North, most men, women, and children who were held in bondage were owned by less affluent white families. And the few personal accounts that we have of those individuals who found themselves, one or two, living within a white household, often describe the profound sense of isolation and loneliness. Very famously, the abolitionist Sojourner Truth, in her recollections of her childhood, describes that kind of isolation born into slavery in a Dutch-speaking family in Ulster County. But I can't emphasize enough that whether in the city or in these rural areas, enslaved people played a critical role in the economy. Men, for example, worked on farms, in shipbuilding, in mills, all kinds of enterprises. Women and children provided domestic labor and contributed to household production, whether spinning and weaving or making cheese and butter and all those sorts of things that would add to household incomes, supplementing their owners' incomes, allowing them to accumulate wealth and property over time. And as such, Black New Yorkers contributed greatly, but didn't always have enjoyment of the fruits of their own labor. So I think it's important to point out how even as a small part of the population, they're recognized as being critically important to the development of the state. And by the latter part of the 18th and early 19th century, they're also vitally important in the development of communities. And we see enslaved people, free Blacks as well, building churches and schools and mutual aid organizations and becoming very involved also in promoting abolition and the move toward gradual manumission in New York, which was very much an endeavor that was pursued by Black and white activists working together to try and end the institution of slavery in New York. It's fascinating to look at different sites, how these dynamics unfold, and I think that we will have three really different case studies here. Lauren, you want to start?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenny, for that really fantastic and comprehensive introduction. As I mentioned, I am the curator at Preservation Long Island. We are the stewards of 4 historic properties across Suffolk County, from the town of Huntington on the border of Nassau and Suffolk, all the way out to Sag Harbor on the east end of Long Island. These are all 18th century sites with deep histories of enslavement and colonialism. One of the major ways we are carrying out our mission is with the ongoing Jupiter Hammond Project, which is an initiative to work with scholars like Professor Anderson and community stakeholders to critically rethink how we engage visitors to one of our sites, Joseph Lloyd Manor, with its histories of enslavement and colonialism. Next slide. So completed in 1767, this immense plantation house is most significant because it is where Jupiter Hammond, the first published African-American poet, was enslaved during the second half of his life, and where he authored his 2 most important writings, both in 1786. And those are an essay on slavery and an address to the Negroes in the state of New York. Next slide. So in total, 3 essays and 6 poems by Hammond are known to us today, and collectively they offer an exceptionally rare perspective on slavery and race in North America before and after the American Revolution. And this poem right here, which I'm just showing you just a piece of, is written in his own elegant hand. And it's also his sharpest critique of American chattel slavery. And I'll just read for you some of the lines here. He opens the poem with, "Our forefathers came from Africa, tossed over the raging main, to a Christian shore therefore to stay, and not return again. Dark and dismal was the day when slavery began. I'm forgetting, all troubles were, and then slaves were made by man." So it's a really powerful poem that had only come back to the surface about a decade ago and has really changed the way that we think about Hammond and his views on enslavement. And it's the only poem written in his beautiful handwriting, and is the only, was something that was never published. So it raises really interesting questions about how he was able to get his writings out into print, whether or not his enslavers were censoring his writings. Was this something that was too, too harsh in its criticism of enslavement that it never made it to print? Next slide. So just to give you some geographical context, Jupiter Hammond was born into slavery in 1711 on what is today referred to as Lloyd Neck, and that's a peninsula in the present-day town of Huntington off the north shore of Long Island. And here, Hammond survived 3 generations of enslavement by the Lloyd family, with the exception of the time that he was in exile in Connecticut during the American Revolution. And over the course of Hammond's long life, he witnessed the displacement of indigenous peoples, the American Revolution, the founding of a new republic, and the slow demise of slavery in the North. Next slide. So for thousands of years, Lloyd Neck, or Comset, was the homeland of the Matinicock people who stewarded its lands and waters for thousands of years. And in more recent history, it has gone by many names, reflecting the impact of colonization and the relationship between place naming and power. Around the time the first Europeans colonized Comset in 1654, the first enslaved Africans arrived on Long Island at Sylvester Manor on Shelter Island. And among them were Jupiter Hammond's paternal grandparents, Tomro and Oyo, who were kidnapped into slavery, survived the Middle Passage, and were enslaved in Barbados before being brought up to Sylvester Manor. By the late 17th century, the Lloyd family controlled the entirety of the Neck and operated as a provisioning plantation called the Manor of Queens Village. And as a provisioning plantation, it produced food and raw materials essentially for shipment elsewhere. And some of the largest enslaved populations on Long Island were held in bondage on manorial estates like Queens Village and Sylvester Manor, which notably provisioned enslaved workforces in Barbados. Next slide. Jupiter Hammond's father, Obium, who had been born into slavery at Sylvester Manor, was among the first enslaved people the Lloyds brought to Queens Village in the early 18th century. And he was likely among the enslaved workers that cut, carted, and put up the timbers to frame the first manor house built in 1711. Typically, just 1 or 2 individuals were enslaved in Long Island households, but at Queens Village, the Lloyds enslaved 10 to 15 people at a single time. And so Jupiter Hammond was just one of approximately 20 children born into slavery in this house between the years 1711 and 1744, and he was likely the son of Obium and Rose. Next slide. Something that's truly remarkable about this history surrounding Joseph Lloyd Manor is how much we do know about Hammond's intergenerational family story of survival and resistance across time and space, enabling us to ground broad historical themes to more personal narratives as we talk about the enduring legacies of enslavement, both nationally and locally. And this is a story that extends even further into the early 19th century and the challenging era of gradual emancipation in New York. Next slide. Especially unique to Hammond's story is that he was one of only 2 people to publish in North America while enslaved during the 18th century. The other was better known Phyllis Wheatley Peters. Hammond's poetry and prose reflects his deep Christian faith as well as West African cultural traditions. A full 30 years before his first poem made it into print, An Evening Thought, around 1761, Hammond purchased a Bible with Psalms from his enslaver, which you can see documented here on the left in the ledgers of Henry Lloyd. Hammond additionally inherited a copy from Obium, who probably passed on to his son as well, the tradition of oral narration long practiced by West African griots or storytellers. It seems likely that Hammond also served as a lay minister for the surrounding Black community, and that his poems were actually meant to be read aloud, perhaps even accompanied by music. In his prose, such as an address to the Negroes in the state of New York on the right, Hammond further encouraged Black New Yorkers to seek personal salvation and confront the moral conflicts of enslavement in the new nation. Next slide. So while Jupiter Hammond resisted enslavement with his pen, Michael Cox did with his feet. Although Hammond's life and writings are hugely significant to the stories that we tell at Joseph Lloyd Manor, we acknowledge that his perspectives and experiences do not reflect all those the Lloyd family enslaved. Following the outbreak of the Revolution, Michael Cox, who also knew how to read and write, in addition to play the violin and read sheet music, escaped to the British, who promised freedom to those who would support their efforts. Although Cox made it all the way to Nova Scotia after the war, along with other enslaved refugees and resettled loyalists, his freedom was short-lived, and he was returned to Joseph Lloyd Manor. Resolute in his bid for freedom, Cox self-emancipated once again, as detailed in this advertisement from 1790. And it appears that he was successful, as he does not appear alongside other enslaved individuals, including Jupiter Hammond, in a 1793 inventory of Joseph Lloyd Manor. Next slide. So Michael Cox and Jupiter Hammond are just two of the more than 45 people that we know of that the Lloyd family enslaved for over a century. There are so many stories to tell, and as we continue the work of the Jupiter Hammond Project, we are learning more and more every day about all the people who lived, labored, and survived in around Joseph Lloyd Manor. So this is work that we are continuing to do, research that is ongoing, and we look forward to continuing to tell new stories at the site and in venues like this. Okay, thank you.
Let me just explain that I left my glasses in the car. These are prescription glasses, and I need them to read. I'm not trying to be cool. Be cool. All right. I don't know if this is such a cool story, but in any case, I will be talking about or reading about just a section of a book that I just completed. I'm very happy to announce. It was sponsored as part of a series of collaborations between the National Park Service and the Organization of American Historians, interested in getting to the public the full story, a fuller story, a more inclusive story of the sites that we consider nationally historic. In this case, Saratoga National Historic Park, which is known as the site of the famous Battle of Saratoga, which you probably learned about in 4th grade or 8th grade history, the turning point of the Revolution. The battle took place on land owned by General Philip Schuyler in the fall of 1777. He had been commander of the Northern Department of the U.S. Army until July 1777, when he was relieved of duty. We'll come back to that in a few minutes. The park commemorates the success of the Continental Army in thwarting the plans of the British and therefore allowing the Continentals to keep fighting and eventually win. The park also showcases Saratoga House, which was Schuyler's country home. He had a townhouse or a house in the city, which was Albany. This was his country estate. This was destroyed in the battle, but remarkably rebuilt within less than 8 weeks. So in this study, I look beyond the park as a site of former national military glory, which is the way the park has traditionally been interpreted. And I explore slavery and slaveholding by the general at the site. So I'm going to really focus on this particular painting. And what you have there is the name of the book, in case you are looking for it later this spring. The tremendous financial success of Philip Schuyler's ventures in Saratoga before and after the Revolution was largely a consequence of his shrewdness. He gave his laborers, enslaved as well as free, some opportunity, however slight, to improve their lives. Their exertions enhanced his own fortunes exponentially. He became fabulously wealthy. A showcased capitalist, Schuyler secured his position ever more firmly by allowing some of those he enslaved to have a turn entering the consumer marketplace. Their small purchases from his store, sugar, tea, or rum, may not have enhanced their material existence much, but the transactions offered bondspeople psychological and spiritual affirmation as human actors capable of independent choice. Some may have even nurtured dreams of accumulating enough store credit to bargain successfully for their freedom. These allowances translated into greater docility, agreeableness, and cooperation. In advertisements and in letters from Schuyler and many slaveholders, you often see the word likely, a likely Negro. A likely Negro was somebody who was cooperative, who was docile. So he was shrewd in cultivating likeliness. One then wonders how these same black captive laborers reacted when they watched Philip's wife, Catherine, order the burning of the family's wheat fields in anticipation of British General Burgoyne's 1777 advance to Saratoga during the Revolutionary War, as her husband instructed. Schuyler's most scholarly biographer, Don Gerlach, doubts that this ever occurred. There is no evidence in the general's correspondence that his wife destroyed crops or that he gave such orders. But I am doubtful of Gerlach, who mentions not one word about slavery in his index. But suppose we look to other possible evidence. The narratives that swell this event may not have been apocryphal. Catherine Schuyler Baxter, the granddaughter of Catherine Cady Schuyler, General Schuyler's youngest daughter, related the theatrical episode in her nationalistic family history by quoting Cady's supposed 1846 account, as well as that of Civil War General John Watts de Peyster, who wrote many accounts of the Battle of Saratoga. True, Cady was not yet born at the time of the supposed event. True, Schuyler had been relieved of his high military post after the fall of Fort Ticonderoga earlier that year in 1877. And Catherine had a personal interest, not Mrs., she was dead, the first one I mentioned, who wrote this book. And Catherine had a personal interest in burnishing her great-grandfather's name to undo any lingering damage to his honor after this public humiliation. By the way, he was exonerated. But these considerations do not automatically invalidate her story. There is significant documentation of British predations against colonist food stores, stealing them for the Crown's troops during the Revolutionary War. For instance, the Schuylers would have known about the British seizure of wheat, oat, and corn in April 1777 during the Redcoats' raid on Danbury, Connecticut, despite the resistance of a force led by Benedict Arnold, who later assisted the Continental Army in the battles of Saratoga. From nearby Fairfield, Mrs. Mary Silliman, wife of the officer heading the local Connecticut militia, had watched closely and recorded the event in her journal. Philip and Catherine Schuyler would not have wanted a repeat occurrence at Saratoga from their ample supplies. More to the point, for my project, is not so much the literal historicity of the wheat burning as the meaning to be drawn from Mrs. Schuyler's purported action, what the memorialized story signified, and the reasons to interrogate the message for clues about African American experiences. In other 19th century publications besides Catherine Schuyler's, Mrs. Schuyler is ennobled for blocking the looting British Army's access to her family's vast food supply. She's venerated for this act, which displayed Philip's confidence in her spirit, firmness, and patriotism. So it's not just her granddaughter. The dramatic memory of the Schuylers' self-sacrificing nationalism was further established by the visual record, Emanuel Lutzer's 1852 painting of this act, which was also incorporated into the Saratoga Monument, standing today within the Saratoga National Historical Park. The monument, which is an obelisk, was completed in 1887 and dedicated in 1912, but it was first proposed in 1856 by the newly formed Saratoga Monument Association. In fact, both Lutz's painting and the monument were part of the contribution of American artists to the process of antebellum national self-creation, the development of a national identity based on a common political culture. After the divisive convulsions of the Civil War, however, that process became reconciliatory, proclaiming national healing and pride. Within the politically fractious decade before the war, however, Lutz's original painting both recalls and ensconces a public memory of the torched wheat fields as an inclusive and unifying event. Folded into the Saratoga Monument as a reproduction in the immediate post-war Reconstruction period, the painting interprets the Schuylers as leaders of a public that is consenting and like-minded in their devotion to the struggle for independence. A barefoot enslaved young man wearing a disheveled shirt crouches next to Mrs. Schuyler as he dutifully reaches to supply her with a lit candle. She looms above him holding a torch she is putting to the grain. Both enslaver and enslaved are dressed in muted shades of red, white, and/or blue, suggesting the pair's patriotic union of mind and purpose. Mrs. Schuyler stands at the center of an ideal, imagined national community of black and white, female and male, young and adult, rich and poor. Significantly, it is the enslaved boy who has the most direct access to the flame, but his use of it is mitigated. It is the candle in his lantern that supplies the fire to the torches used by Mrs. Schuyler and the older of the two white girls, perhaps intended to reference a Schuyler daughter. While he has the potential of ignition, he does not use it. He does not set anything afire himself. Instead, the slave, in a crouching position and lowest to the ground of all the figures, is guided by a white man, probably representing one of the general's overseers at Saratoga. Directive power rests with him. In this way, Lutze visually affirmed Black subservience to supervision by whites, a comforting image for them, particularly regarding the use of fire, which was universally feared by enslavers as a ready tool for protest in the hands of those they enslaved. Indeed, enslaved people use this weapon of vengeance in numerous instances throughout the Atlantic world, from Brazil to the Caribbean and North America. Anxieties about violent slave resistance swelled in North America on the heels of the 1791 Haitian Revolution, leading whites to increase their surveillance of enslaved people. In Albany, for instance, a fire set by 3 slaves in November 1793 resulted in the destruction of 26 buildings and prompted legislation restricting the free movement of enslaved people in the city. In contrast, Lutz's painting works to allay fears of Black insurrection and instead aligns those in bondage with a different revolution, the American Revolution. The canvas memorializes a compliant, submissive servant taking orders from the enslaver's agent, thus folding their acquiescence into the nation's revolutionary founding. Just one more paragraph. The visual narrative repeats the theme of the faithful wartime Black servant in another popularized memory of the Revolutionary War at Old Saratoga. In this account, told by 19th century historian John Brandow, an enslaved housekeeper detected a hostile Indian hidden on the 2nd floor of the Schuyler residence with the intent of murdering the general with a knife. The unnamed female slave saved Schuyler's life by whispering the danger to him, allowing him time to arm himself and shout to the imaginary guard as she quickly exited the room, deliberately trampling heavily on creaky floorboards that gave the impression of several men rushing to the defense. I don't believe this happened. Tricked by the enslaved woman's smart deception, the alarmed would-be assassin dashed out of the house, but was captured in the attempted escape and taken prisoner. Again, though, the actions of Schuyler's enslaved workers seem to synchronize perfectly and almost naturally with those of their enslaver. But consider the perspective of the enslaved youth who might have been helping destroy crops that Tom, these are some of the slaves that we located, Tom and others among Schuyler's enslaved workers had grown for Schuyler or for themselves for their own personal dividends. In this light, the figure in his askew red shirt functions as no more than an appendage, a less than enthusiastic assistant to Catherine's patriotic act. According to the published chronicles of this episode, Mrs. Schuyler turned her attention to saving her Saratoga grain crop from the oncoming redcoats, quote, with her own hands to the astonishment of her Negro servants, end quote. In these accounts, the slave's surprise serves as a foil for the Schuyler's bravery, patriotism, and sacrifices. The servant's shocked reaction effectively underscores the Schuyler's selflessness. Yet, if the spotlight is turned away from the Schuylers and on to those they enslaved, the stunned response of bondspeople witnessing the torching may well have been gut-wrenching distress rather than speechless admiration. They may have watched with dismay as their investment of daily physical exertions disintegrated in the fires. As enslaved people, unlike their enslaver, they had no material means to rebuild their material lives or to feed their aspirations, except what Philip Schuyler permitted. All of them must have worried about their own futures. If the general were utterly ruined, might they be sold? Here, I'm just going to name them. Tom, Harry, Dick, literally, that's the names they were given. Bob or Coleman might have thought of the grain, the fish, the potatoes, the hogs, the stashes of lumber, the fruits of their private labors, which they were used to exchanging for cash and credit. Would such opportunities evaporate completely? What the Schuylers destroyed in the heat of battle and revolutionary fervor to achieve their political freedom, at least according to this memory, this public memory, those they enslaved may have lamented as the disappearance of the nearest approximation of legal freedom they might experience in their constricted lives.
Thank you. Really a virtuoso in reinterpretation of a familiar painting.
Absolutely. I want to keep listening. Okay.
Sylvia,
Hello.
make sure that microphone.
Oh, certainly. Wow. So, hello, everyone again. I am going to briefly speak about the process of doing this master's thesis that I told you all about. And the first image that you see projected is of Christ Church Graveyard, which is in Cooperstown. And Cooperstown has a graduate program there in public history. The program was founded in 1964. And the lens that most students approach that come there, it tends to be more of a kind of social history lens. And at the time that the program was developed, it was unique and special for its ability to ask a different set of questions of the field of history, to really kind of tease apart what does it mean to create an archive? What does it mean to have words like provenance and history of ownership? What does it mean to have connoisseurship? Is something important because one of the presidents touched it? Is something important because it has material culture, uniqueness to it? What about the everyday lifeness of objects? Those aren't answers, those are questions that we were trained to consider. So I come to Cooperstown from Birmingham, Alabama, and I come passionate about those questions. I don't have the answers. I want to learn how to do that work. And in the first week, we participated as a cohort of 12 in a kind of introduction to the village. So as I began to take a tour with the rest of my cohort to the village, the guide stops us at Christ Church Graveyard. Christ Church Graveyard is known by a lot of people who love Cooperstown as the place where James Fenimore Cooper is buried. And also it's a very historic and stunning, aesthetically remarkable building and fascinating cemetery. For me, I was captivated by a single sentence that the guide gave that said, "And here are where the enslaved people were buried." And it was intriguing because they are buried in the same grounds. I come from Alabama. I'm so much more used to a kind of invisibility of Black burial grounds. And so also, not to say that that is the narrative, that is, I'm telling you in real time how I processed it. We now know that African burial grounds have countless examples, and Black burial grounds have countless examples of invisibility, not just in the South, but also in the North. But in real time, I was fascinated by, wow, there's this set of rows where Black people are. This is evidence of something different from what I'm accustomed to hearing and having narrated to me. And I asked the tour guide, what do we know about them? Who are these people? Is there a book I can buy? Because I'm in this village for a couple years and I'm curious. And he said, no, actually there's not a lot that has been published about them, but myself and another local scholar, we've been doing this kind of, local work. And you know what? If you want to do this as your master's thesis, I'll be willing to assist you. Tom Heights was one of the individuals' names, and McDougall was another. And so they became very, very substantive guides to me, to the village, and to the local history process. So what I'll say before I say next slide is the thesis that I wrote, I titled it More Than a Passing Notice, because I found during the course of doing archival research a newspaper article that was an obituary of an African-American woman by the name of Sarah Jackson, and that was a line inside her obituary. The line said, "This woman deserves more than a passing notice." And it just felt so apt for Sarah Jackson's life, who was a domestic and a cook, but also apt for so many other of the people in the village that I was trying to learn the history of and to help narrate. All of these individuals deserve more than a passing notice. They deserve to be considered on their own terms, and that became work for me to try to figure out okay, cool, they deserve to be considered on their own terms. How is the next question. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. So I give you literally my process of the question of where to begin. And it's a question of archives, methods, and history. And this is a photograph of a woman by the name of Jenny York, who is buried in Christ Church Cemetery. And her tombstone reads, Jenny York died February 22nd, 1837, age approximately 50 years. And the epitaph reads, she had her faults, but was kind to the poor. And she's buried in the Black section of the cemetery. And when I read that, I'm like, just to think, she had her faults, but was kind to the poor. What does that mean? And why is that on her tombstone?
Exactly.
My goodness, So I start doing research, and I find this text that's by Ralph Birdsall, who was the rector of Christ Church. And the rector of Christ Church, that burial ground site, published a story in 1917. It was republished in the 20s, and it's been republished many, 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 many times since then. It's kind of like a local history thing that everyone has on their shelf in the community, because it has so many rich names and stories. Like, just the family stories are often narrated and continue to live beyond that text, but the memory-making process and the history-making process, the clunkiness of it, are very much tied to this text for Cooperstown. And so I found within this book this reference that says, a favorite servant of Justice Samuel Nelson's household for some years was a free Negro named Jenny York, who had been a slave in her youth. The current story is that when Jenny died, the Negroes of the village chose for her grave an epitaph, which at the request Judge Nelson caused to inscribe. So the story suggests that, the story that is now being told and narrated from the village perspective of the rector was, this line was chosen by Jenny's peers. And it was chosen by Jenny's peers to be ironic about something. And those peers, those black servants and or previously enslaved by the time that she died, it's 1837, those black people, in their efforts to give her a honorable burial, thought about satire. Now, I do not know if they actually requested that line, but I'll tell you what it's in reference to. The Birdsall goes on and says that Jenny was the cook in Justice Samuel Nelson's house. And Justice Samuel Nelson, if you're not familiar with him, he was a Supreme Court justice who served on the Taney Court with Dred Scott decision. He had a concurring decision, and his biographers are very passionate about everyone knowing his issue wasn't the same as Taney, but he had a concurring opinion. And if you know the Taney, this ruling, it was over the issue of slavery and the idea of civil rights and citizenship rights. And Justice Taney said the black man has no, the U.S. has no rights that the black man is bound to respect. So essentially, not just continuing the idea of precarity of black life in the country, but codifying the idea that even free black or black people in vague questions of freedom, any black person that was seeking citizenship rights, recognition, access to, was denied that with this kind of decision. And so Justice Nelson lived in Cooperstown, and his one of his servants, Jenny York, was known to share food with the other servants in the community. Was known to, the internal community joke was, and also I'm not sure if it was a joke amongst the actual black community, that was after Nelson had parties, and even in the process of Nelson having parties, Jenny was a little light on her serving. Because what was left after the party could be enjoyed by the rest of the people that were serving the party and that were engaged in the labor of hosting the other servants, right? And before that, the other enslaved people, because we're talking about, there's something interesting about so many of these individual stories that I found was, there is this moment of how does gradual emancipation shape their lives in 1827? What does that do for them? What does that do for their relationship to themselves, to each other, and to their previous enslavers? And so it's a messy process, this time period. And so if I ever slip up and say servant, sometimes it's servant, sometimes it's slave. It's because of the chronology. But I want to say something that this woman's epitaph suggests to me is, one, we know out of looking at the reading against the grain, she was enslaved, likely born enslaved. We know that even in freedom, she remained in servitude and not wholly independently, economically free. We know that she and her community of peers lived in Cooperstown in a kind of precarity. Free black identity did not create autonomy and sovereignty, bodily autonomy even in itself. So we still see this kind of precarity of her condition, and something that on the surface, is often self-narrated, and I see this Jenny York reference in other Cooperstown texts as a kind of casual, look at her, isn't she slick? I read it as hunger too, it's hunger. I am going to manage how I dole out resources so that I can help feed people who are not given sufficient opportunity to be independently able to feed and support themselves. And so this is a kind of example of the many narratives and stories that I interacted with, and it's a motley, messy process. And so as you see me looking at my panelists, I know the mess behind the process. Like every story that's been narrated in this so far from this panel, it is a beautiful narrative. I mean, the process of teasing it apart, what's behind it, the reality of slavery is incredibly difficult, but to have people able to turn the messiness of the archive into a narrative that can be wholly understood and considered is powerful. Next slide, please. So, what happened do you recognize these? So my master's thesis would not have been possible, full stop, had it not been for, there's one thing to have questions, there's another thing to say, oh wait, there's people that have been working in this same area. And actually they've created scholarship. They haven't created just articles, they created books. And so, it's a longer story, I will not go into that detail whatsoever, because my wife told me to focus on what I'm presenting. But what I'll say is, there was a point where I was trying to find I found it difficult to figure out these little, very different, varied kinds of stories and sources. I had a hard time figuring out, well, where is the narrative within it? And so early on, I found Dr. Armstead's text. Thank you to Dr. Gretchen Soren for the recommendation. And these books just help me see the vast history of Black life, Black community life, like what it was to exist in the Hudson Valley region during this time period. And then I started seeing and thinking more intentionally about something that Saratoga Springs and Cooperstown had in common, which is this hospitality, like this idea of travel, this idea of, for some people, the whole this hospitality industry drove much of the employment opportunities. And this, when I say employment, I'm talking about after, but also drove so much of the condition of Black life under that, of people that were enslaved in Cooperstown as well. So these two texts, one edited by the other, wholly the body of work of Dr. Armstead, helped me dramatically. And if you're interested in this topic at all, she didn't say it, I said it. Lord, please don't take me in August is a really, like if you're interested in questions of like the greater New York kind of, and the same thing with the Almighty Change, Tall Within, I'm saying these are wonderful texts to begin from, and also the sources are incredibly rich. And William Cooperstown, which is, so many people are interested in Cooperstown, like as a place, you know, not just the Baseball Hall of Fame, but like James Fenimore Cooper's story, his family story. And Alan Taylor's work has some, it does consider, and it elevates various examples of Black people that were enslaved by the Coopers, and or Black people, the idea of what Blackness represented within James Fenimore Cooper's, like, as a literary field. So those were great texts as well. Next slide, please. And the work was done totally in the village, not surprisingly, because I told you I was there for grad school. What I will say is, Cooperstown is conducive for learning. It's a perfect environment for, like, in the wintertime, it's very kind of quiet. It is it's a summer retreat, you know, and so people retreat after the summer. And so there's people that live there, but for the most part, it's fairly quiet. And so this was where I did, if I wasn't in class, and if I wasn't at the playing basketball at the Clark Sports Center, I was here. It was at the New York State Historical Association's library, which is now the Fenimore Art, part of the Fenimore Art, and the records there are remarkable, and that is where those local scholars and those local genealogists were incredibly helpful to me, as were the librarians that were there. Wayne Wright in particular was a remarkable archivist that gave me access to collections, some that had not been processed yet, and some that had been processed, but within the unprocessed parts of those collections, I found the most interesting things. And so there was also a network of other scholars that would come through. Obviously, Dr. Brad Matthews at Hartwick College was doing some work on African Americans during the Civil War time period. And also out of this Nisha library, I saw these collections like the Smith and Telfair collection, which is a photography collection. It's a remarkable photography collection of 19th century images, and Smith and Telfair owned a studio right on Main Street, and they took pictures of everybody, everyone. And hotel staff would sometimes come through and just have portraits taken together with their friends and family before doing those very, if you were coming up for summer work, then they would take their pictures and things alike. So the collection is vast, as well as the Florence Peasley Ward collection, which is all of this is like local Otsego County and or Cooperstown collections, and these family papers. Next slide, please. The family papers created the greatest opportunity to learn more intimate stories about the people that were enslaved by these families, as well as after the gradual emancipation process, the people that were servants and or employed by. And this suite of images represents a way forward, the way that the kind of methodology out of the project of well, how do I tell this story? As I told you, all of these different stories, these intimate parts and components. And I want to say also, Christopher Sturba, my advisor, in my second year was incredibly helpful, because in my first year, there was a very dramatic thing that happened. My advisor died in the first 2 weeks of me being in grad school. And so my whole first year, my advisor, it was, yeah, so you know what it was. What I'll say is, Dr. Armstead's book became my advisor. Like, I had it on my shelf, and Gretchen, of course Gretchen, but also Gretchen is a director of a program, and she's teaching and she's consulting, all this other stuff. But Dr. Armstead's book was my advisor for my full first year. And for my second year, I had Chris Sturba. And so what we teased apart became, well, how do we think about the work thematically? What are people doing? And what can we learn from the work that they were doing to tease apart any kind of personhood, biography, identity? And so what we developed was, we're looking at biographies overlapping with census records and overlapping with art. Because what was most representative was art representations of these individuals. There's all of these photographs, and or they're in paintings, because families, families painted various events that they would do, and like if they went hunting, they're in hunting photographs, or people went fishing on the lake, they have these images of their favorite people, right? Their favorite servants or their favorite enslaved people, and that gets into the kind of messiness, I want to say, the methodology, the messiness of the archive, like similar to that kind of Jenny York story. It's like, isn't it funny? She was taking food from us, isn't it? Ha ha ha. And it literally ends up on the tombstone. There's a kind of messiness in these paintings, and it's like, why was this created? And why is this over your family mantle? That kind of stuff. So I tease it apart, and then so we see these 4 different kind of types of employment within the village. So in the center is Joseph Thomas Husbands, who is categorized, 20 years later, I think his labor is insufficiently categorized by me as like a day laborer, insufficiently so. I wish there was another way to label him, but I'm reading it alongside with what the census records, how they most often label him. But this man's story speaks to the New York chronological historiographic story of slavery and freedom. So he was born in Barbados, and he was born in Barbados at the same month that his master's son was born. Both of them had the same name, Joe Thomas Husbands, because the master's name was Joe Thomas Husbands. Little white boy, little black boy, a little slave boy, a little free boy. And the family story that the records are in Nisha, we're in Fenimore Art Museum now, tells a story of this little black boy and this little white boy both being brought from Barbados into Philadelphia because they were Quakers and they didn't want to have slavery, this young white boy's life, be conceptualized on a plantation. They didn't sell the plantation. They didn't close the plantation. They didn't free the Black folks on the plantation in Barbados. That continued to be the business by which they were able to do what they did, which is move into the US. And they found themselves paced or relegated in some ways because Philadelphia's Quaker population was going through this revolution of what are we going to do with slavery, and the Quaker population said we're not doing this, within the U.S., right? And so now you have these plantation owners from Barbados that are bound up in this relationship, and so they moved to Cooperstown because they could not exist in the same way. It reads, if you read against the grain, it shows that they moved to Cooperstown because they couldn't exist in the Quaker community as enslavers. And so in Cooperstown, they could exist, and they created this community for themselves, and they freed Joseph Thomas' husband's parents because they brought them over as well. The parents came in, Joe Thomas, so they freed them, and they all stayed on as servants. And Joe Thomas his life becomes narrated as a kind of a tour guide of sorts, a character of tour and tourism. Hunting, taking people fishing, his cooking on the banks of the river after you went fishing, whatever you caught, he would cook. He was a musician. He told all kinds of stories. Anybody and everybody that came through the village, if you were anybody, you got a tour from Joe. I mean, governors and presidents. He was the host of the village, and so learning more about him made me want to learn more about his descendants. And I'll say after the thesis was done, I heard from them, because once it was done, it was published. And so the irony is his family moved to Tennessee. They moved south. So I'm trying to pace with time. I'll say the last 3 stories represent the other ways to think about this, which are the labor of domestics, which is Betsy Stockton, whose story, if you were to know it, is far greater than the story of something that can be narrated wholly up under the position of domestics. She was a missionary that went to Hawaii, one of the first Black missionaries to travel all over the world, and established the first Black church in Princeton. And she has papers in the Fenimore Art Museum, because she wrote back and forth to the family, and she's buried in Cooperstown alongside with Frank Clark, an African-American barber and skilled barber who fled during the Underground Railroad from Alabama and settled in Cooperstown. And so much could be said about him, as well as on the left, the representation of the largest population of folks that came through in the summertime was like this kind of hotel worker as a trade. And so this story wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for people doing this kind of work on the ground to help preserve the archives and tease it apart. And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, all of you. Wonderful, wonderful stories woven together. I think we have time for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question, I'll just repeat it into the microphone so that it goes on the recording. Any questions from our audience? Yes, sir.
First, thank you all for your work. And I know it's a lifetime endeavor, and I know you'll continue producing wonderful information. Jupiter Hammond, didn't he connect with Phyllis?
That's a great.
Repeat the question.
Oh yeah. So the question is whether or not Jupiter Hammond connected with Phyllis Wheatley. That's a really great question. And the short answer is I'm not sure, but it's possible. So Henry Lloyd, who was the one who had built for him the first manor house on Calmset, and it's in his house that Jupiter Hammond was born into slavery. Henry Lloyd's third wife, Mary Clark, her first husband was Ebenezer Pemberton Sr., and they had a son named Ebenezer Pemberton Jr., and he actually knew Phyllis Wheatley. And he was one of the number of esteemed gentlemen of Boston who attested to the verification that her poems of various subjects was actually written by her. He also delivered a letter on behalf of Phyllis Wheatley to her friend Ober Tanner. So Joseph Lloyd, who also enslaved Jupiter Hammond, it was his brother, stepbrother, who knew Phyllis Wheatley. So there are very close connections between Hammond and Wheatley. Hammond also wrote an address to Phyllis Wheatley. Yes, yeah, yeah,
Because if you think about James Baldwin, Nikki Giovanni.
Yes.
Okay, so there's this interview
Yeah.
that they,
Yeah.
4 hours, it's just rich, right? So you got Jupiter Hamilton
Yeah.
older,
Yeah.
you know, and then you got young Phyllis.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, and different, right? He was born in the United States.
Yep.
Phyllis came from Minneapolis. She witnessed stuff as a child.
Yeah.
And had a different perspective. And, she was like, wow, young lady, what am I gonna do? And that whole accommodationist kind of
Yeah,
thing.
yeah.
And, hey, Black New Yorkers, you kind of need to go along with the program and maybe we'll be there, right?
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. So I think it's possible that they may have actually met through the family that enslaved him, and they were definitely aware of each other. Yeah.
One other quick question, sorry, y'all. Charlie Harris, I always center Christian questions. This question before, would you work like you? Because I work with cultural historical trauma. Y'all do this work. You can't not do this work without healing. How do y'all take care of yourself?
Wellness. The question of wellness. Well, I think the answers are going to be very different. Some of us have spiritual lives, that help. I do. There are interlocutors you talk to about this, to buttress you. And then I think sometimes you have to stop. You really have to stop and let things soak in and sort of regain the ability to tell the story and not just react to the story. I think I told this panel this experience I had in doing this work. Came across the Philip Schuyler papers are all digitized. They're all available through the New York Public Library, over 1,000 papers. And so when you're looking for evidence of enslavement, it's a very tedious process because, first of all, you read so much that you don't see it actually mentioned, and you start to fall asleep, and you could easily miss something. So I was reading about an exchange from the quartermaster, the person in charge of getting supplies for the Northern Army of the Continentals, to Philip Schuyler, who was in charge of that. And he was reporting from Quebec, which we had access to for a brief period early in the war in 1775. We won Quebec from the British, and the British got it back. But when we gained access to Quebec, we could get, the United States, the new United States, could get supplies for sort of rare luxuries from Europe, which were no longer available through New York and Boston, right? So this quartermaster was reporting that he had gotten some supplies, and I had been reading, and I just thought, another dull military thing, and I was gonna just keep going. And then I just kind of woke up at one item on the list. So he talked about catgut, gauze, and I'm thinking, and he talked about nails, so I'm thinking all of these things are needed by the military. And then he said, I got a carpet and some other things, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, they're mixing private consumer goods with army supplies. And then I thought, well, maybe not, because, the military generals, if you've ever been to the Washington headquarters in Newburgh, they lived better than the common soldier. So I thought, well, maybe it was for, for that. Yeah. And then finally I saw where he said, well, I hope you don't mind. This is a real paraphrase. I went over budget. I saw this exquisite carpet and I knew that you wanted it, so I got it. I exchanged the wench for it. And so, immediately, like at, I don't know, 2 a.m., I sort of woke up the wench. A wench was that was a black woman, and an enslaved black woman. And so that made me go back and look at what the other items that I had sort of put to the side as military purchases, and then do more reading. And then I found out that there were more that were for private consumption than I thought. Well, the gauze, for example, that, it's another story. But then he said, I've got to leave quickly because the purchasers are beginning to discern her character. Lazy, intemperate, and there was something else I can't remember right now. And I just had to stop. I just had to stop. Lazy, intemperate, and dirty, dirty, lazy, and temperate. So I don't know if I don't know how this woman got to Montreal. Was there some instruction to try to get rid of her if they could? I doubt it. But here was, an officer who made a command decision, like, I need more money.
Yes, yeah.
So the commodification of this human being was just thrown in my face so graphically. And then the way in which the sort of the denigration of her was just naturalized.
Yeah.
Dirty, lazy, intemperate.
Right.
And so the casual reader, and I just thought about Gerlach. Now, he read everything, and that never hit him at all. So I had to stop, for a minute, because what rushed to mind and to heart and to emotion was why this woman might have been dirty. There was no way in which the enslaving population saw its role or its part in what they observed. Why would she be, what's lazy? What is lazy?
Right.
Might she be depressed?
Right.
Might one of her children have been sold away? Might she have been denied, a relationship, that she wanted? And then you read other letters where, for example, there is, I'm taking too much time to answer this, but you have to stop, sometimes until you can sort of begin to talk about this and explain it. Not explain it away, but plumb the depths of it in a way that enlarges the understanding of slavery.
Sylvia, you want to speak to that question about
No.
the emotional
Please.
challenges of
Sure.
your research?
It is a really good question, and full transparency, I'm still figuring it out, but I figured it out through practice. I absolutely have a faith practice as well. And also my friends, I have friends right now that are here, and when I talk, I'm talking to everyone, and it's beautiful to have friends looking back at me, because it creates a space to just, for me, it creates a psychic space of conversation. This is a conversation, so friends and family, and physically, you said it from the position of therapy. Because of therapy, I have learned that it physically can shift, it being stress, it being what I read, it being these narratives, the raw narratives, like not the ones that are become beautiful by writing,
Yes.
but the ones that are crudely ugly in the archive form, like just numbers, people, that. I physically feel it, and I physically remove it through exercise. I'm a walker, I'm a runner, I'm a marathoner, I'm a half marathoner, and in the work of doing that, it doesn't change what I read, but it gives me a capacity to hear, to understand how to respond to it.
And just one other thing that this example made me think of, the conversations that this kind of discovery provoke
Yes.
can be troubling, but ultimately healing. So, for example, when I found that, I just wrote about it, and this is all in the pandemic too. So,
Goodness.
so you're just, sort of in isolation. But I was constantly in touch with the National Park Service staff, and they were helpful in that they had different interns over the years who had sort of pulled aside anything they saw in the archives that referred to servants. They hadn't put anything together, but at least some of the it wasn't raw yet. It was just sort of the primary sources were there. So I drafted something when I could about this, and I just kept going on. I was writing about the war, and I got an email from two of the staffers. We have never seen this letter. Where is it? And so that was another moment, because they were in many ways the authorities. So I was so glad that I had copied the URL, and I knew that they had to process that. And they were processing what I was finding in the letters as well.
Yeah.
And so, I just sort of let that, I sort of shifted the difficulty onto them as well, and so once they worked through that, then we could really talk. And ultimately, I think they were very happy and they were enlightened about it, as was I.
Yes, yes.
I certainly was. I just thought, this is deep. This is harder than than I thought it would be, but it's so important. Yeah.
Other questions? I'll go in the back there.
Yes, we have one from Zoom. Actually, a couple, but I'll do the first one first. So did any of you find that the enslaved folks that you researched stayed and lived where they were previously enslaved, if or when they were free?
So the question is, in our research, did we find that any of the people who were enslaved stayed in the area in which they were enslaved after they were freed?
Let's talk about Jupiter.
Sure, yeah. So I can talk a little bit about Jupiter Hammond's story. So we have no legal documentation of his manumission, but we believe that he was freed around the time that Amelia Lloyd died in 1792. Hammond never married, didn't have any children, but we're pretty sure that he actually lived in the town of Huntington with his grandnephew Benjamin and his wife Phoebe in that time period. And Benjamin was one of the first people of color to purchase a house within the town of Huntington. So he lived in that small family home with them, just, off the neck, but closer in town. And that's where he lived till the end of his life. And Jenny is reminding me here as well. So at one point we know that the Lloyd family set aside an orchard for Jupiter Hammond that we suspect helped him support the young family that he lived with in freedom in Huntington. And what ultimately happens is that after he passes away, that orchard does not pass down to Benjamin or Phoebe. So ultimately, the intergenerational wealth that had so benefited the Lloyd family over the 18th century does not happen in this situation for Hammond and his family. And so after Hammond passes away, Benjamin and Phoebe, also, in addition to suffering this personal loss, there's also this financial setback that happens as well. And Benjamin is forced to sell the house And there is record in the archive of the town of Huntington that he does then have to present himself to the overseers of the poor of the town of Huntington. So there's this really heart-wrenching and powerful conversation in this challenging, complex moment of gradual emancipation in New York in this post-revolutionary new nation period. And you can see in this early moment the seeds planted for the enduring, impacts of enslavement that still survive, on Long Island today.
And I recently finished another one of these reports for the Park Service looking at the William Floyd estate also on Long Island, and I think that provides another interesting example of this, because beginning in the 17th century, that estate relied on the labor of the Unkachug Nation, which was right adjacent. So Native people would basically commute, if you will, from their homes to work on the estate alongside enslaved Africans. And they actually intermarry those communities, and then when slavery ends, many of them do continue to live in the area and to work, but for wages by that time period. But what's interesting that the last hints that we see of that kind of exploited labor of indentured servitude actually was Indian children who would be, if their families couldn't afford to take care of them, they would be put into household service. And then the elders in their lives would have been the enslaved men and women who were still, or the formerly enslaved men and women who were still working there at the estate. So there's a lot of really complex family relationships that get shaped by that. But the other thing that happens is that as people get their freedom and want to move and relocate, many towns on Long Island and elsewhere in New York begin to put into place various kinds of laws to prevent mobility and to force people to stay in the town in which they had residency. So where people stay is not necessarily where they would if they had their choice about it. So there's a lot of necessity, and then there's ways in which the state kind of intervenes in order to keep labor where they want it in ways that are coercive.
I want to add slavery and freedom, they're not the same, but I am intrigued by the late 19th century examples in Cooperstown of the precarity of these are free Black folks. And so people that had moved and from the South in particular, I'm thinking like barbers or various other skilled tradespeople, by the end of the 19th century, even though they chose a community, they wanted to stay there, they're getting pushed out by these kinds of guilds that are established and have race-based membership requirements. So like Frank, one of my examples, Frank Clark, he's an African-American barber that joins the Civil War and fights for the Union and settles in Cooperstown. He was enslaved in Alabama, and he builds out a robust business, a very active, he's the barber on Main Street. But by the 1870s and 1880s, he's getting less opportunity to continue to do his work, to stay in the village. He stays there till he dies, but he's pushed out by this kind of a state law of barbering trade, that the certification system. And the same can be said for those hotel workers. There's becomes hiring practices where people that European immigrants became more selective and prized to be employed in the hotels in first person positions. And so African Americans were relegated to the less skilled considered positions within the hotel business trade in Cooperstown. And that's something, of course, that modeled the Saratoga case.
Yeah, but where? So with the Schuyler house, amazingly, I didn't find anyone who stayed. They got out of there. There were runaways, and even well, first of all, Schuyler was very reluctant to manumit, but when he did it in his will, and his sons who inherited the property they just didn't seem to keep enslaved people, at least on that property. They may have on other parts of the patent, and yeah, that's all I'll say.
I think there was another question down front.
Yeah, I have a question about your findings of the scholars and a ledger that they kept for purchases by enslaved people. My work has been about a woman enslaved on Long Island named Liz by the Townsend family, who were wealthy shipping merchants, and they kept a separate ledger for enslaved people of the town of Oyster Bay, not the people they enslaved, but others in the town, that included amazing purchases like perfume, fine teapot, spelling books, and then also sundries and rum and such. And so is that ledger book as wholesome? Does it have a wide range of kinds of things these were purchasing?
Repeat the question.
Oh, the question was about a ledger book that I mentioned that Schuyler kept. And the question is, how comprehensive was the book? Well, first of all, the book included everybody who bought and sold. So it wasn't just about the enslaved people, but enslaved people are there. I compared that ledger to ledgers that we know from Albany around the same time that are in, there's a piece in the Mighty Change Tall Within book. And there is a difference. The people who were buying in Saratoga were all male. Whereas in Albany, I think the majority of the enslaved people were, enslaved and free black, were women. And in Saratoga, there were, the purchases were usually, I would say, sort of holiday kind of purchases. Rum, tea, sugar, even around that time of year. But it was interesting that they were bringing in grains and foodstuffs, hogs.
Were there enslavers' name mentioned along with their name?
Yeah, well, it's the Philip Schuyler ledger of his slaves and other people that he did business with in the area. Yeah, but what you've got sounds really interesting and really needs to be unpacked and interpreted because, I mean, the school books.
Right.
I mean,
Spelling books.
Two
yeah,
spelling books. Wow.
that's fantastic. You'll have a lot of fun with that.
It's at New York Historical Society.
Yeah, and they just, I should say, now that I'm done, the account book is digitized.
Great.
Other questions?
Yeah, so I know that probably most of the archival research you all have done is around these large plantation agricultural estates, but I'm wondering if you found any areas of transition from being domestic servants or agricultural workers to industry, because I know that as emancipation takes place in the state of New York, it also that's also around the same time that there's heavy industrialization along the Hudson River.
So the question is whether any of our research has focused on enslaved people who shifted from domestic or agricultural labor into industry.
Yes.
Yeah, I haven't explored this in much detail, but I suspect that many of the people who were enslaved by the Lloyd family at Queens Village, there was also pretty prominent brickyards that operated nearby in the early 19th century, and I know there was a big black workforce there, and I don't know if you can speak more to that, but the connections between those two places.
Yeah, I think that you follow the money. The individuals who were investing in industry were often also those who were holding enslaved people. So for example, the Floyd family out on the East End that I mentioned before, they begin to try and diversify out of primarily agriculture, and they found an iron forge, they started a shipbuilding yard, they invest in several different kinds of mills, and in each of those they had enslaved people and local Indians from the neighboring nations who were employed there. And it's not always clear as you get into the early nation period exactly what people's legal status was, but we do know that some enslaved people were there in the late 18th century. Okay. Les, thoughts?
Not much in Saratoga, although the son who eventually gets the house invested in the first cotton mill in the area. And, but it fails. So, we don't seem to have, clear evidence of that. I think the canal is interesting. It's not industry in, sort of the classic 19th century sense, but the Champlain something canal, which is just like a northern extension from Lake Champlain down to Old Saratoga, Schuylerville, and then, then the Hudson takes it the rest of the way. That was a big project of Philip Schuyler himself, and his sons continue that. And the reason that's interesting to me is because Solomon Northup worked in building that. So, canal building, I think, was an employer. And then it's not really until the late 19th century, there's other evidence that I'm thinking of Edie Quinn's work on the Hills in Westchester, which was a Black community near White Plains, Harrison, White Plains. And she does a fabulous job of looking at this free Black community in the mid-19th century. And these were communities that were established around land that was given by Quakers during the period of gradual manumission. So they were agricultural. The Civil War is a turning point. They go off to fight in the war, and sort of the world opens to them, and then they gravitate to New York City, and the community sort of dissipates after that. Same thing happens in, Rockland County, Skunk Hollow, another community very much like that.
If you read the Brooklyn Eagle from this period, you begin to see a lot of hints of growing ethnic stripe as new immigrant workers are coming in, and as you were mentioning, displacing earlier patterns of employment. I think we are out of time, so can we join me in thanking our panel again?
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, panelists. This was a powerhouse panel. I wish we had more time to keep going because this was really, really interesting. Just a couple of housekeeping things. If you're online, we have a survey that you can fill out. If you are in person, there are surveys on the benches. Please fill those out. It helps us to build a better program for the next time. Also, I wanted to let everyone know that our last Dyckman Discussions panel, titled Remembering Slavery and Freedom in New York City, will be on Thursday, June 8th at 6 p.m. And the panel will take place in person at PS 98, which is on 212th Street here in Inwood, and is also at the site of the Inwood Enslaved Burial Ground. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. So I hope that you all will join us either in person or online. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you.